But yeah, there's only been 2 assignments. So one they've turned in, and that was the Genogram. And then this week we have our eco map. So we were going through different stuff on the eco map last week. So essentially, in psychology and social work, when you first see a client, you want to get background information of everybody. You want to get their history, do an assessment. And in social work, they started doing what's called a genogram. And what the genogram is, if I can, I can maybe even film it over here on the board if it's willing to feel it here. These are heavy. So we were doing the family history. It's still plugged in. That's true. Okay. Good point. I gotta wheel it together or make this one go further. I can film it from like there. I guess you were able to see this. You've already done yours. So we tend to go to like 3 generations of family members. You'll have like your mom and your dad. I don't know if you have any brothers and sisters or like, it's okay if you don't.
I'm my mom's only child. Dad has kids.
Okay. And so we're trying to go to 3 or 4 generations because sometimes we want to get like a genetic history of our families. There's several videos on how to make a genogram. And the point being, when you see a client at first, you want them to be aware of their like history and background and what they're coming into it. You may have a genetic history of alcoholism. You might have a genetic history of addiction in the family. Something to watch out for. It might be like biological illnesses, so challenges that are cancer and things of that nature. So just letting them know all the stuff you inherited, and then we've started dipping into then even adverse childhood experiences. So the ACEs, maybe you grew up with the alcoholic family, there could be sometimes domestic violence or other types of abuse or things of that nature. So that's what we were doing mine. So I have obviously a mom and a dad. My mom came from 8 and my dad came from 6. So they're big families. They had 5 of us and I'm the middle child. So that actually would be me. And then both my sisters had 2 girls and a boy. Both my brothers had 2 girls. And I just had my first daughter last year and my first son this year. We've got some alcoholism on either side, both sides. So I bring that into the mixture. We even have some, like, I think it would be my mom's brother was diagnosed with bipolar. My mom's mother was diagnosed with bipolar. And it gives your client an understanding of the history of what you're bringing in. Like you could be genetically more likely to have mental illness, or you might be genetically more likely to have, this, that, or the other. So that's the point of the genogram. That one was due, was that last week or 2 weeks ago? I'll keep it open so you can turn it in, obviously.
Okay.
We have people getting added late or starting, and we all start at different times, and you can catch up. We're only on chapter 4 still, so we've kind of gone through, really it's almost like a human development class. I think in psychology you guys have to take human development. So this is very similar, but it's a human behavior, hbse, human behavior and social experience with the things that you grow up with, starting at conception. So the first really like 1 or 2 weeks, we were doing just the details of obviously all the different circumstances children are born into. And even with conception, we kind of went over women are actually only fertile for 24 hours exactly, but because with the man, sperm can live 5 days inside the woman. So there's 6 days if you're trying to have a baby. Then we went through like the different stages in the uterus. The baby can actually live outside of the womb at as early as 23 weeks or 24 weeks. And then the different circumstances you're born into. So if you're born into, for instance, Afghanistan last week, and it's kind of it's been at war for 20 years in Afghanistan. The trauma that the baby can bring with it forward obviously is recoverable, but those could be some things you want to work with. If you were born into, well, I'm even thinking other wars like Vietnam or even a hurricane or a natural disaster, earthquakes, things of that nature, some trauma that you can bring. And basically, we're up to, well, even just like a few slides ago, I feel like we just had the baby at, well, from birth until, your birth weight doubles in 5 months. Then I'll try to play it so that it's bigger. I have to look at it this way. Strange. It looks like it's crashing on me. Huh. They could have a large or a small head size, and that could be other cognitive deficits. I know it does this weird crap down here. I can never get over that, but I don't know how. Infant brain. The brain growth is most critical in the biophysical human development. At a year, it's like a half the size of the adult brain. Well, yeah, my daughter was born in May. She was 6.5 pounds. No, she was born last year in June. And she got to like 13 pounds by 13 weeks. My son was born in May of this year, so they're only 10 months and 3 weeks apart. He was like 6 pounds. He's already 15. Yeah, they're definitely Irish twins. It's insane. In fact, she just sent me a text like, I don't know if I can make it through the day, as we both were up like all night taking care of them. She's up more than I am. So the environment you're born into, and then 20, 30 years ago, one income earner could take care of the entire family. Now it's more like 2.5 jobs or 3.5 jobs have to pay for like the cost of living and how expensive things have gotten. So you have parents that are away from the house more, and you have some issues that come up that way. Things of that nature. I want to try to, I don't want to do presentation mode today. It kind of annoys me because I can't show you guys videos. Then we were getting to the milestones. So that's more at like the, they help you understand like, it doesn't take into account the quality, like the clinical experience needed, the station, the posture and sitting, the gait, the movement. So milestones come up with babies, and I'm learning them more because I have 2 kids of my own, and I'm watching them grow up. We've had to take them to the doctor at 9 months, 18 months, 24 months. They give them like 800,000 vaccines. And then they start these things. So at 1 month, he's learned how to turn his head. So did she. At 4 months, they can roll over. Like that's, and last week we were getting into also up until 4 months, it can be really dangerous for a baby. They call it sudden infant death syndrome because the baby can't roll over or turn his head. So if it like falls in a cushion, it can suffocate. So you need to, that's where they had the push on the movement of hbse movement. The baby has to be alone on its back in a crib. And they've pushed that because Cincinnati, Detroit, a lot of the Midwest has really bad sudden infant death syndrome statistics. So they've had a big push of education, giving out free cribs so you don't fall asleep like on the couch and then the baby like falls in between the cushions. Like stuff like that easily happens, and it's just because you're exhausted. So up until 4 months, that's when the baby has more movement of its head and neck and can even roll over if it needed to. Then at 7 months, they can sit up. At 10, creeping well and then cruising around the furniture. And then at 12 months, they take their independent steps. 14, standing without pulling up. And then 16, that's an interesting one. You can walk backwards. I guess that does take different muscles to be able to do that. As they say, if you like do exercise backwards, you use different muscles than walking forwards. It's like twice the workout to run in reverse, which would be weird. So we've gone from conception a couple weeks ago. We're moving kind of fast, and a lot happens. We were talking about the brain development, the stuff that children run into, and then where is this one? Really the exposure that they have I know we've already watched this one, but I feel like there's another video in connection with child development, but just like some of the ACEs that come up, and how they can lead to addiction. That's a video on that. Emotional neglect. So this is also another one. This may be the same video that you just watched in the previous class, but it's about still face. And what this is showing is the baby really does absorb a lot of stuff in their early years. So.
Okay, so I haven't seen a lot of ads lately telling me to refinance.
I love commercials, but I'm going to skip it.
Many of us are wandering the world, bearing a lot of emotional damage.
Do you guys see it
We
okay?
may be depressed, anxious, or very difficult around sex and relationships.
Sorry.
We might ask ourselves where the difficulties came from. It's a continually weird, provocative, and yet, in our view, extremely accurate answer that the damage comes almost always from childhood, especially early childhood. How we were cared for as infants and young children has a disproportionate effect on how we will relate to others in adulthood. What we need, above all else, is a responsive parent, an adult who looks after our needs with sensitivity and kindness. This is quite literally life-defining and life-saving. It sounds like nothing much and nothing too hard, but without this kind of responsive love, we are wounded for life. Many of us have been. So, to become the truly effects of neglect on children. One of us next is Dr. Ed Tronick, Director of the Child Development Unit at Harvard University. Together with his team, he's responsible for one of the great experiments in the history of psychology, known as the still face experiment.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
So you have this example over and over, and you'll see it now done many times. One of the earlier classes said, "Did you ever do it with your kids?" I was like, "No, I can't. Like, I have a messed up friend who's done it with his son." I'm like, "You're just messed up. I can't do that because, like, I want them to be happy, and I don't want them to experience that." But it's a good example of how quickly, we think about what our first memory was, and usually you don't remember stuff until you're like 2 or 3. So people are like, "Oh, you're fine. That baby's only like 10 months or 12 months old, so they're not going to remember it." But the truth about brain development is she gets flooded with cortisol. She doesn't have mom come back and soothe her like she is. If during our heroin epidemic, you have an overdose. The mom can be passed out for 5 hours. So the baby's trying to get the attention, or they're hungry, usually every 3 or 4 hours, and they don't get their needs met. So then it carries on further on in life, that it's harder to trust people, that it's harder to engage with people, and why this early childhood development is so important. But in the past, we used to be like, they're 1 or 2, just let them cry it out, they'll be fine. That used to be the old way of taking care of it. Like, let them cry, they'll be okay. So there's a new school of thought, which is this.
Watching the baby get distressed can be a high trigger. If a child can get so upset over a few seconds of cold and unfeeling behavior, we have a sense of what can happen over years or more of neglect. No wonder some of us don't feel so well inside. We had an equivalent of a still-faced parent for our first decade and more. But knowing how vulnerable we are shouldn't merely sadden us. We can take stock of how we've been failed and understand the link between the past and our present difficulties. Psychological research, like the still-faced experiment, is at the forefront of helping us to understand ourselves emotionally, shedding scientific light on the origins of our sadness and complexity. Along the way, the experiment proves something else beyond doubt. Love isn't a luxury. It's a gateway to our very survival and sanity.
Most books that want to change.
So there's several, like I said, you can find so much research on this. If you go to Dr. Nadine Brooks, she has an amazing TED Talk that we watched some of about adverse childhood experiences and some of the things that come up with those. And we also had the bad still face experiment. So that may have been the video before this, two in front of it. So I will get back to our PowerPoint though. So a lot of this is all happening in the first 1 or 2 years. So it's just like so much brain development. You, as a social worker, we can help gauge a lot of federally funded social work programs and psychology graduates work. And I was a psychology graduate in 1996. I declared a major in psychology, and then I found out getting a license in social work is when I added the master's in social work. But we're often funded by what's called the Head Start programs. And there's a lot of the places you could get jobs. And we're like kind of looking at these different milestones and gross motor skills. After walking backwards, kicking a ball with demonstration, you kind of teach them how to do that. And then at 2 years, they can kick a ball, jump with 2 feet off the floor, and throw a ball overhand. And some of the red flags while you're watching for the development is if they cannot sit at like 9 months, and then if they can't walk independently at 1.5 years. That's like some of the stuff we look for. This is what the chart kind of looks like. So again, sitting, lifting your head at 2 and 3, being able to even roll over at 4 and 5, sitting up at 6, 7, 8, and then being able to hold yourself up at 8, and 9 crawling, 10 holding yourself up, and walking by 11 or 12. That's kind of like normal development that we go through. Then there's your fine motor skills. So it's usually smaller muscle activities. So like holding a rattle placed in the hand, batting objects at 3 months. So 2 months holding the rattle, 3 months batting objects, 5 months reaching and grasping objects. 6, they can transfer like hand to hand. At 9, they can bang stuff together, start throwing stuff at 11, and then they get their pincher. The pincher grasp is like when they pick up little pieces of cereal or blueberries or something small. Then at 14, imitates back and forth scribble and a 3-cube tower. At 20 months, adjusting a spoon for eating. So even at 1.5 years, they start learning how to feed themselves. And at 22 months, closing a box with a lid and imitate a vertical line. And then finally, at 2 years, a child could create a 6-block tower, feed themselves with a fork, or a spoon, removing clothing, and then grasp and turn a door and a knob. So there's some things when you're first born too. We want to assess their nervous system. So sleeping, they have wake states that provide useful information. They also have active sleep, which is periods with eye movement. Quiet sleep, which is periods with no eye movement, kind of like the REM almost. And then unstable sleep patterns that have been observed in many types of atypical brain development. So when a baby's sleeping, the hard part for us, like we have 2 babies at different stages of sleeping. So they're like 14 months and 3 months old. So they both wake each other up all throughout the night. So sometimes you get like 1 or 2 hours of sleep, it feels like, because it's harder for us to get back to sleep. As both of them, we're working on it, but they all have different sleep schedules. And
They sleep in the same room.
they technically don't, because they both have a crib in separate rooms, but like sometimes they get so pissed off they can't go back to sleep, so we just bring them in the room with us and she falls right to sleep. So that's the hard part. And when they're in the same room, they wake each other up. So like he's in a bassinet next to the bed. He has his own crib, and then she has her own crib. We were old parents, so we wanted to move fast, but we didn't realize we would have babies that fast. We're like, oh crap, that was fast. We thought maybe it would take like 3 years. Most people take like 3 years to have a kid, or 4 years, because it doesn't always happen that quickly. You know what I mean? Like we were going through before conception, there's a lot of things up till 3 months, a high risk of miscarriage, and then most miscarriages happen in the first 3 months. A lower risk of miscarriage from like 4 to 9 months when the baby's born, going into labor. Some of the stuff that can come up, I guess early sleep patterns predicted subsequent developmental outcomes. And so we keep an eye. We try to let them get as much sleep as they can, however they can. Sometimes we drive them around. Like for our weekends, is like driving around, go to a drive-through, eat, let them sleep in the car. They sleep best in the car. And it seems like asinine, but that's like, it gives my wife a break where she can sit down. I'm just driving, so yeah, it uses some gas, but they sleep because like the car has like that motion and movement. And they need, I think when they're newborn, it says it in here somewhere, but they need like 13, 14, 15, 16 hours of sleep every day for their brain development. So some of the questions at the end, like how can we tell whether a baby is developmentally delayed? Like in the womb, they can also see if the baby has trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome. There's also some ages and stages questionnaires that help you assess the newborn. Then you even get into what is infant mental health. So the field promotes healthy social and emotional development. The 0 to 3 diagnostic classification task force was created during Bill Clinton as president. So they've funded a lot of things like No Child Left Behind, this way to assess kids, and the task force defined like mental health from birth to 3 is experience, regulate, and express emotions. Learn how to form close, secure, interpersonal relationships. That's what you saw in the still face, like how you interact with your kids. And then explore the environment and learn in the context of the family, community, and cultural expectations for young children. So these first 3 years are like critical, and why, they keep stressing more and more to do things with your kids. After 3, you can go to preschool if you have access to it. Some like counties are funding preschool and free public schools. And then by 5, I guess you can go to kindergarten. Like that would be the youngest you could start kindergarten, which makes first grade at 6, 5th grade at 10, and what is that, 8th grade at 13, 14? So some parents start kids in school way too young. Like my mom always thinks she started me young, and that's why I got in trouble as a teenager. I was like 17 when I finished high school. I was a middle child, so there's Adlerian psychology that goes into that too. You know, if you guys ever ask about those types of things. And just a lot larger focus on the child development and getting to the different stages where kids are safe and why social workers get a bad rap for taking kids from the home, which there are twice as many social workers trying to keep kids in the home as there are taking kids from the home. But if there is addiction, drug abuse, mental health, domestic violence, they do try to get the kids to a safe place because of these developmental issues that could come up and the importance of development. But then ideally reunifying the family after the parent gets help or addiction recovery or things of that nature. So any questions on up to that? You get to watch this one twice today.
That's okay.
Luckily, it's only 2 minutes.
Babies this young are
Still faced with dads. So they did it with moms and they also did it with dads. And again, stressing the importance of one solid adult in your life, one important adult for kids to develop properly.
What we've learned over the years is that babies are much more capable than we initially imagined, but they're also much more vulnerable. And in Antronic's stiff-face experiment, we get to see both in a very short period. We see the baby and the dad playing together and their routines, there are things that they know about each other, things that they do together, and it's fun. Then we ask the dad to turn away, and when he turns back, to keep his face completely still and not respond to the baby. And the results are almost immediate, and they're devastating. The baby looks to the dad and tries to get the dad to get back into those games. Hey, we were just playing just a minute ago, weren't we? We were having fun, what's going on? And then the baby starts to get frustrated when that doesn't work. So she'll have to look away, look around the room and find something else, and then look back and say, now can we play? And within 3 minutes, the baby is really calm. She is trying to get out of the chair. She's uncomfortable. She's reaching out to dad, crying. And then we ask the dad to turn away again. And when he turns back, to go back to being regular dad. And it's a joyous reunion. They get back into their routines, the things that they do together, the things that they were just doing 3 minutes before. And the baby settles down and gets back into the comfort zone that she's developed with the dad. What we see in the still-face experiment is how able the child is to initiate and be part of the relationship between the father and the child, but also how much she depends on that relationship in order to keep an even keel. When she's grounded and comfortable, she can explore the world. She can meet new people. She can try new things, and she's got that safe base that she can always rely on. There's a trust level there. We can only begin to imagine what it's like for babies whose life is like that 3 minutes all of the time. And they don't get that responsiveness, and they don't get any help getting back to an even keel. And the results can be very tragic. They can have trouble trusting people, they can have trouble relating to people, and they can have trouble being calm enough so that they can explore the world and take part in the world. So we know that those initial relationships, that initial responsiveness and interaction between the father and the baby are keys to the baby's success as a child and as an adult.
So that can come up in many ways. We mentioned addiction and heroin epidemic. It could be something that's not so negative. It might be the parents, to no fault of their own, that they have to work 2 or 3 jobs to pay for the kids. So they have no time to engage, and hopefully there's a good childcare where they are getting engagement. Sometimes you have childcares, I don't know what the numbers, sometimes they have different ratios, like you've got to be 10-to-1 or like 5-to-1 with staff and kids, so that you don't have kids sitting in a dirty diaper for an hour and a half at a time and getting the diaper rash from it or something. But the bad state of the economy today is if we have parents that have to work 2.5 to 3.5 jobs to pay for a household of 3 or 4, you don't get as many of those experiences with the kids. That as teenagers grow up, you have other influences on the outside that can be a bigger influence than the parents, and where some of those challenges do come in. We will get into attachment theory a little bit later, but like how you can build a secure attachment with the mom. I feel like I was starting to watch have you guys, in psychology, you always hear about little Albert. Have you guys studied the little Albert experiment? Can you remind what that's about? As I'm like blanking. It's kind of messed up, but I feel like he was abused almost, essentially. It's okay if you can't remember. I'm just like, huh?
Take a look.
Right. Well, yeah. So this would be the opposite of care and concern, and this is again getting into the ethics of a psychology experiment. And luckily, we have ethics in place. Back then, they had no ethics in place, so they were actually able to do messed up stuff like this. And the guy turned out pretty bad, actually.
I would recommend Comigo if you have anxiety because it is very effective and I love it.
Phobias are a fascinating part of the psyche. Some are completely understandable and possibly even evolutionary, as being scared of dangerous things and creatures is pretty beneficial for survival. But the question has eluded psychologists. How are phobias present in some people but not others? And can you condition a fear in a human test subject? This question would lead psychologist John B. Watson and his assistant graduate student Rosalie Rayner down a very ethically questionable path. Not only was experimenting on a human controversial, but the test subject would be a 9-month-old baby. Today we're looking at the controversial, heartbreaking, and morally questionable baby Albert experiments. Welcome to the dark side of science. Nothing about the statement experimenting on a 9-month-old baby sounds good, and the idea to deliberately scare an infant is very off-putting. The experiment is even more controversial in the monkey mother studies, as long-term effects could be scarring for an otherwise healthy human child. As such, I'm going to rate the experiment here 8 on my ethical scale, as the subject had no say in between parts of the study, and the alleged sourcing of the child was not, shall we say, the most praiseworthy way. But before we get to baby Albert, we need a little background to the person behind the experiment, John B. Watson. John Broadus Watson was born in Travelers Rest, South Carolina on the 9th of January, 1878. He was brought up in a strict Christian family, but things would change in the teenager's home life when his alcoholic father left the family. This would cause John to become apathetic towards religion. The family later moved to Greenville, South Carolina, where Watson would get a chance to meet people of different backgrounds, igniting his interest into psychology. His secondary education was marred with run-ins with the law, for fighting and bizarrely discharging a firearm within city limits. However, he was still able to gain a place at Greenville's Furman University at the age of 16. His time at university was difficult, having to work several jobs. He didn't excel and did not create many social bonds, which led people to think of him as lazy and antisocial. But he persisted and at the age of 21 gained a master's degree. He managed to get into Chicago University a couple of years later, and finally his career started to take a more positive turn. Studying under some notable professors, including John Dewey and James Roland Angell, Watson began to develop an interest in behavioralism. During his time at Chicago, he read up on the work of Ivan Pavlov, known for his classic conditioning, a discipline which would directly influence Watson's later experiments. As a side note, this is the same Pavlov with the dribbling dog. I should say that during this time, Watson had got married and was the father.
Do you guys remember the Pavlov Dog Experiment? So they ring a bell and feed them, and then they test if it salivates. And it's kind of like that training, the classical training. This guy's going to do the same thing, but with a baby. And he gives him like something cute or soft, like a stuffed animal or a rabbit, and then scares the shit out of him every single time he sees the rabbit, which is kind of messed up. So this shows the trauma that carried over for the rest of this kid's life.
2 children, but his marriage would break down, but this will come a bit later on in our story. In 1902, Watson gained his PhD whilst working as a research professor at the University of Chicago. In 1908, Watson accepted a faculty position at Johns Hopkins University, being promoted to chair of the psychology department not long after starting. He continued to study behavioralism, releasing a paper in 1913 named Psychology as the Behavioralists Use It, a manifesto of sorts laying out the goals of the new discipline. Behavioralism, as Watson saw it, sought to understand behavior by only measuring observable behaviors and events, and that these actions were influenced from external stimuli. As a consequence of that, individuals' history and learned behavior from reinforcement or punishment. This new form of psychological study wasn't initially accepted by the wider scientific community, but gradually the new discipline would make inroads to be a recognised field. The discipline would be expanded upon by scientists like B.F. Skinner, aka the guy who made a pigeon-guided bomb, which I made a video about a long time ago. Check it out if you want to see a even worse produced playmaker video. In 1915, Watson served as the president of the American Psychological Association. Watson would continue to produce papers expanding on his views into behavioralism, which would reject the study of consciousness, with his important career in 1924 book, Behavioralism. But before we need to look at a couple of very turbulent years for Watson, which brought about the Bailey Albert experiment. In 1919, Watson released a paper called A Schematic Outline of the Emotions. During this study, he observed a number of infants which revealed 3 fundamental emotions: fear, rage, and love, each caused by a set of conditions. Watson used various animals to observe the reaction from the test subjects. In most cases, especially when introduced to dogs and cats, the infants showed a neutral or an inquisitive reaction. But when introduced to a pigeon flapping its wings, most subjects showed surprise or even fear of the motion and sound. To induce fear, some of the test subjects were placed in a dark room or in a room on their own. Needless to say, the children became distressed. Now, these tests are pretty mild and generally yielded predictable results. But what if you can get an infant to fear something that had initially yielded a neutral response? For example, one of the cuddly animals from his 1919 study. This would be done by introducing a neutral stimulus, like a rabbit, with a scary stimulus, for example, from a loud banging sound. They tried to answer the following questions: that if a fear stimulus could be transferred to other animals or other inanimate objects.
So this study was found to be abusive, like he should not have done this, but in the early 1900s, there wasn't an ethics board or a committee to like hold him responsible for this. So he was basically able to do whatever he wanted. And he continued to cause the trauma to this kid, scaring the shit out of him for like several months, really.
Once the fear of being conditioned in the test subject, they also went to find out for how long. Right, this is where the study, in my opinion, crosses the line. As the sourcing of the test subject and finding a parent willing to allow their child to be given a phobia would be understandably difficult. Baby Albert was a child of a wet nurse at the Harriet Lane home, a paediatric facility on the Johns Hopkins campus. Now, it's not 100% known how Albert was found. Clearly, a major contributory factor was the convenience, as Harriet Lane was adjacent to the Phipps Clinic, where Watson's infant laboratory was housed. There are three possible ways Watson got hold of Albert that have been considered. The first is through a paid study. The second is by using his connections at the hospital to coerce and allow access to the infant. And the final is from doing the experiment without the mother's knowledge. But we will never know 100% how Albert was found by Watson, and we don't even know if that is his real name. What we do know is that he was selected due to being healthy.
So these are the videos taken. They actually have video recordings of the baby being abused this way. So that's the other messed up part about it.
Unemotional child who rarely cried. The experiment wasn't just conducted by Watson alone, but also one of his graduate students, Rosalind Rayner. I should say that his relationship with her had caused issues with his breaking down marriage by late 1919. At the start of 1920, and at 8 months and 26 days of age, baby Albert was entered into the study. Albert was observed reacting to a number of live animals, for example, a rat, a dog, a rabbit, and a monkey, and various inanimate objects, including human masks, cotton, and a burning newspaper. During the initial phase, Albert showed no elevated signs of distress or major reaction to the stimuli. What Watson and Rosalind did see was elevated distress when a metal bar was hit with a hammer, which created a large amount of noise, sending little Albert into a burst of tears. 2 months would go by after Albert's baseline observations before the experimental conditioning would begin. Watson and Rayner attempted to condition him to fear one of the items that had previously garnered a neutral response. A white rat was chosen to be an item to condition Albert's fear response. This was done by presenting the animal to the infant, and every time he touched it, the metal pole was hit with the hammer, creating the scary noise. It wouldn't take long for Albert to start to fear the cuddly animal. After 7 pairings of the rat and the noise in 2 sessions, 1 week apart. Albert reacted with crying when the rat was presented subsequently with no loud.
A lot of people that have cats are unknown.
So they're banging the crap out of like a cymbal and scaring the crap out of the baby in the process anytime he touches the cuddly animals.
She had a connection. The rat is the bad noise.
Right. And it did long-lasting trauma to this kid. So they did actually follow up on studies about it.
He doesn't know why the rat scares him. Because he just have this impulse.
Right, yeah, because like even we hear like a loud banging noise or whatever, you hear something that sounds like gunshots, you kind of like duck, you know what I mean? Like that's just your natural reaction. So that's kind of what they were doing with him.
Well, he didn't seem as distressed when he was allowed to suck his thumb, which hints at a phobia not actually being created. A couple of weeks after the conditioning, Albert started to fear other similar items that shared similar characteristics with the rats. The generalized fear manifested whenever the family dog, a fur coat, some cotton wool, and even a Father Christmas mask was presented to the infant. A couple of weeks after that, Albert's fear of the rat had died down, including the response to the other similar items. This prompted Watson to recondition the infant by presenting the rat again with the loud noise. Each reconditioning would only take a few rounds of the scary noises, but what of the questions set out by the pair before the experiment? How long does the condition last? 31 days after no exposure to the test items, Albert was shown a rat, a coat, and Santa mask. He again showed a fear response. Not long after the final experiment, Albert's mother withdrew her child from the study and left the hospital for good, leaving little trace of what happened to the test subject. This had 2 downsides. The first was that Albert was unable to be reconditioned to not fear the rat and the link to fear-producing things, and the other issue was that the study was incomplete. Right, well, taking into account that the experiment happened over 100 years ago, we do have to look at it in the context of the time when experimental psychology was in its infanthood. And the study was even one of the first to be filmed at a great cost to the university. By today's standards, the experiment was morally, ethically, and even scientifically on shaky ground. The first two reasons are pretty obvious as well. Experimenting on children is just wrong, at least in my eyes. But the scientific failures are very...
So if you guys have to do a study for your final senior paper, we have what's called the Board of Ethics. You'll see it's the IRB, the Institutional Board of Ethics. And we have to submit what we want to study, how we want to study it, and what the study looks like. So he's saying this would not get passed there now. But 100 years ago, we didn't have the IRB. That only came after the Tuskegee Airmen and syphilis experiment. And really World War II was the, there's an international law that forces ethics on anything that, we have to medically put into our body or take that's not been rigorously tested.
Important to consider. The study did not have a control subject involving only one infant, which makes the data hard to interpret, and one result does not make a conclusion. It's almost impossible to know longer-term effects on baby Albert, as we may never know if the phobias, if any, created during the experiment were long-lasting. We will never know for sure what happened to Albert, or even if it was his real identity. Researchers into the experiment have a couple of potential identities, with one dying at the age of 6 and another living until 2007, but we will never know for sure. Some doubts present as to whether or not the conditioned fear response was actually a phobia. This was due to a reduced response when the infant was allowed to suck his thumb, which almost made him be able to ignore the loud sound. The experiment was responsible in part for destroying Watson's working career, but not how you might think. What came out later in 1920 was that the psychologist was having an affair with his assistant, Rosalind Rayner. The scandal would result in Watson's dismissal from his job at Johns Hopkins University. The affair became front-page news during the divorce proceedings in the Baltimore newspapers, destroying the psychologist's reputation and with it his university career.
So an affair.
Not that that was the complete...
Right, yeah. He had an affair, essentially. And again, that's why we have in the Code of Ethics that we cannot have relations with both our clients, and a lot of agencies go to no commingling of the coworkers. You know what I mean? If y'all meet while you work at the same agency and you want to get married, that could be okay, but one of you will probably have to go work at another agency. You know what I mean? That's usually how it goes down, which is fine. It's because it could affect the quality of the work that you're if they're making out in the laboratory or whatever, they're not getting good results, so that's something why they have the rules of ethics for dual relationships. But this was a good example that they said two possible outcomes. The one is that baby Albert either died at the age of 6 or died at almost 100 years old in 2006 or 7. So getting back to, having the ability to self-soothe and adverse childhood experiences, that's a good example of an adverse childhood experience. We'll get into more of the videos and research and even what Dr. Nadine Brooks has to say about childhood trauma and different things that we'll pick up on with self-soothing through addiction. It could be food or eating disorder, sexual addiction, sometimes gambling, other things are more likely if you don't get therapy. Now, if you do get therapy, everything can be okay. The video I wanted to finish with is just this 4-minute, 58-second one, but about childhood trauma and how we have to find ways to overcome and give therapy access to everybody who needs it that have had ACEs or adverse childhood experiences.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes. And they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions that look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff. And they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's hard to get out of that. And it's harder to really go to learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on. But it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention, you make putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kick here is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain is kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
So with a trauma experience, we as social workers have to find ways to get those kids back into the safe space, to have the ability to learn, the ability to listen to things, the ability to go into the safe and learning brain. When there's a trauma brain, and they talk about that in the ACEs, and we'll get more into adverse childhood experiences all throughout the semester. You guys will hear about it more than you want, but it covers almost every area of psychology and social work and fields of practice that we need to get into to serve better. But if we, for a long time, and I mentioned this last week at Lighthouse Youth Services, we gave ADHD diagnosis. And in 2010 and 2011, they gave the ability to diagnose PTSD in children. Before, it was only reserved to veterans that had been in a war and maybe just Vietnam War. But when they opened it up to PTSD can be given to children, they noticed that both ADHD and PTSD had similar elements of diagnosis, but they have different treatments. So if we don't address the trauma for someone with PTSD, they may never get better and always exhibit signs of ADHD and the inability to focus and have a hard time to learn and get through school. When we address trauma and we can create safe spaces to learn and the ability for your mind to open up, it's easier to be creative and get into the creative mind and use creative intervention. So as social workers and teachers, we want to have that safe space, have a safe area for talk and dialogue and openness for our students, essentially. I searched the wrong documentary that I wanted to. It's not abandoned, but it's and I'll ask now, do you guys have any questions at this point? I know we're covering a lot at this point to get in all the stuff that kids are exposed to and adults, but it's amazing that like you can carry that from your childhood into your adulthood. And that's kind of why we do the Genogram. That's why we also look at the eco map. The eco map is what's due on Thursday, and similar to the Genogram, it's looking at like what our weekly and monthly activities look like. Where do we spend most of our energy? What kind of energy do we have at our home, at our school, at our church, at different places we go to, and how is that exhibited? So hopefully some of those were helpful for you guys. I can't remember. It's a foster care documentary. We'll watch this next week, but I wanted you to at least get a foreshadowing. It's not Unwanted either. That's kind of sad. So any questions about the eco map and Genogram? For those of you that still have to do the Genogram, and then Thursday we have the second assignment due and the second discussion on the eco map.
How long are we?
We had a good eco map one that we were looking at last week, but like at least covering all the areas that are like of the good and the bad energy of the spaces that you create. Like here she's showing her energy with her mom and her dad are good back and forth. She has kind of the connection between them. So the strong connection between mom and dad, she gives energy to them and gets energy back.